A Bradenton mother and her infant son were found dead in a house fire, but according to investigators, the two did not die in that fire. They were killed.
A firefighter heading into work spotted the fire and found 18-year-old Diamond Shellman, as well as the baby inside.
It was so sweet. I don't see how God could let something like this happen to her.
Somebody come and explain to me, I don't know what's going on, man.
So I just having a conversation, figure out what's going on here?
Yeah.
Where were you at this morning? You said you were home?
Yeah, I was home. Yes, I woke up because Diamond called my other baby mom. She called. She was like, I didn't want you to think I was keeping him away from you because I had company over and stuff like that. And I told her it was fine. So then she asked me that I want to come over.
What time did she call you?
It was 5. She was like, well, do you still want to see him? I said, yeah. So I come see him for a little bit.
I think Larry Williams is somebody who thinks he's the smartest person in the room. I think he thinks of himself as being pretty smooth. He's got 2 women who have children close to the same age by him. He's living with one girlfriend. We know that Larry Williams has had a criminal record. He was accused of initiating sexual contact with individuals who are under the age of 12. So it really is remarkable how calm he is and how there's such a lack of anxiety when he's in the room with these 2 seasoned detectives. His lack of anxiety, I think, is partly his confidence that he can handle whatever is coming up.
You went over there, didn't go in the house?
No, I didn't go in the house. She brought the baby up.
So everything was fine?
Yeah, everything's okay. Diamond okay?
Did you go to the door?
Yeah, I went to the door. When I went to the door, she was like, got company back there. She dismantled and stuff, and she was with them all day. She told me she was with them all day. And she wrapped the baby up, and we walked to the car, we sat in the car, I seen them, played with them, and I was gone.
Larry, killing me here, but I'm telling you that, okay? Y'all are having a tiff over something. Those apartment walls are thin. People can hear everything. People know everything. You can't hide.
When I left, everything was perfectly fine.
You keep saying him, there was no him. There's nobody else that left that apartment.
At this point, the detectives are giving Williams some indication that they know he's not being truthful. Like many psychopathic individuals, there's an active sort of exchange that goes on with law enforcement where they're always engaging in this impression management, trying to advance their own narrative. For detectives, Williams is already out of the gate trying to control the narrative of what's happened. He's trying to preemptively direct detectives to look here and not look there. Look at this other person she was just starting to date. Maybe that's the person who hurt her. That's the last person who was with her.
Do you have a temper?
I have a temper, and I can't say it's bad temper, no. Bad temper.
Did you love her?
I have love for her because she carried my child. Yeah, I did love Diamond. I do love Diamond.
What's your kid?
Those are the kids, the reason why I get up every day, and I'm a good dad.
He says, I did love her. He sort of slips up and puts that in the past tense, and then when he catches himself, he brings it back to the current tense, and that all there just highlights his unsophisticated approach to this interview. He's not really thinking 10 steps ahead. He's just trying to get by and be cool, calm, and collected. But he's really just this unsophisticated individual.
I need you to do me a favor. I need you to sit in the chair. Then do this with your fingers. And I'll put them in your lap. Okay. And a dog's gonna come in, just don't move. I don't want the dog to bite you. She bite. Only if I tell her. Okay. Come on, this way. See? See? Come on. Come here. Come here. See? This way. This way. All right, come here. Over here. She can't do that. Turn.
What does that mean when you do that?
It means that you've been in contact with some kind of accelerator. She's making a positive alert on you for an accelerator. Anything from rubbing alcohol, gasoline, diesel fuel, lighter fluid.
I rub my face down with alcohol when I shower.
She's learning to eat them.
The thing that's interesting about Williams is that he never shows any outward signs of stress. Many people in this situation would suddenly become aware that they're under suspicion for some serious crime. They've brought a dog in who picks up on accelerants, and the dog hits on Williams not once, but twice. But Williams doesn't miss a beat. He doesn't seem surprised. He just quickly explains it away. He stays in control of the situation. He just gives them an explanation and moves on.
Have you been around gasoline this morning?
No.
Well, that dog said you did. And we know you have. You were around gasoline over at Donna's apartment this morning.
Wait. Y'all trying to say I went over there and started a fire in her apartment? I have this gas smell on me every day and it burns my skin all the time.
Williams is someone who's pretty comfortable lying. He's comfortable not telling the truth, and he's not concerned about being found out. He just has what seem to him to be reasonable explanations for everything that's about to unfold.
I was talking to my son's dad last night, and he was telling me all types of weird stuff, like how little men attack him while he's sleeping.
We were planning to go see that new Jeepers Creepers, the scary movie, and then she was telling me she used to see that and all that. And I was like, "Oh, you talking about when you see things?" She was like, "Yeah, I see things, but I don't mind it. There's demons and all that." I said, "Oh, guess I ain't the only one who see things, but I don't pay no attention either."
Like what? When you say you see things here and there, like what?
The damn thing off The Conjuring.
When you were over her house, what did you see over her house? I need you to think back. Seriously think about what did you see?
It was the same damn thing, bro.
Do you call it? You have a name for it?
I don't. The last time I was laying in the bed and I opened my eyes, the room was red. And it was like something was under there. And I looked up at it and it was just standing over me, just holding me down. And next thing you know, there's eyes in the closet.
When you parked at Diamond's house, just still there?
Yes. It was trying to get inside me.
It made it inside you. It controlled you, and it did something. That's what we need you. We need you to tell me what it did.
I don't remember anything.
Now he's ratcheted up his story, and he's wanting the detectives to believe that there's a demon that's inside of him. I see things, I hear things other people don't. It doesn't normally cause me stress, I just ignore it. And yet, on that day, it was someone that was trying to hold him down and scare him and control him. It was trying to get inside him, and it may have been responsible for whatever bloody, awful, violent stuff happened in that apartment. It just doesn't add up. Williams is a seasoned criminal, but he's not a seasoned mental health patient. He doesn't yet understand the inconsistencies in the story he's offering and why it's implausible. And the detectives capitalize on that. They join him in his delusional statements, and they join him in these explanations, and they want him to now tell them, what is it that the demon did?
I need you to tell me exactly what they did and what they did inside that house.
It's actually here now. This thing is making me angry, and I don't like it. It's right there in that corner, and it's just shaking his head.
Which one of them poured the gasoline?
The other one, the reason why you smell gas on the lid, the other one burned me.
Because you tried to stop it,
I'm
right?
trying to stop him.
Because the detectives are joining him in this story and they're showing him what he believes is empathy and kindness and understanding that he has these mental health issues, he just gets overconfident and starts spinning this story that now spins out of control.
And who did the big one burn?
It was all
Diamond?
over the house. Yes.
All over the house. Did he pour it on Diamond?
I don't recall. I remember Diamond, she stumbled in the room. I didn't go back there.
When he was pouring the gas, where was your son?
He was with Diamond. Is my son okay? Where's my son?
Your son's still in the apartment.
Is he okay? What do you think, though?
No, okay.
I hope there was. I don't know, man. You told me I just lost my child.
No, I'm not buying these emotions here. I mean, this is somebody who knows what has happened to his son. And I think the fact that he puts his head in his hand and kind of looks down is something I see so often when people, they don't have the genuine emotions, but they know that they're expected. When we look at psychopathy, I think that most psychopaths do have emotions, but they're always related to themselves. They feel pleasure, they feel anger, they feel frustration. It's all about them. When you're talking about emotions toward other people, like empathy, like guilt, like remorse, they're absent. And so he's got to figure out how he should be acting and then try to do that.
Who had the knife at that point?
It was just Diamond in that damn thing. That's it. That thing. That is gray and that got red eyes.
They made you turn on Diamond, right?
Me and Diamond actually decided down and we were starting about taking ourselves out.
About committing suicide?
Yes.
Why?
There was too much.
What were you gonna do with the child?
The plan was for my aunt to pick up the child.
Were you supposed to kill yourself afterwards?
I was supposed to
But you escaped?
I was supposed to lay down in that fight.
You were supposed to lay down in that fire?
Yes.
Williams goes into now yet another variable of his story in that he was going to die. Him and Diamond were gonna, kill themselves and he was supposed to die, but for some reason he lived. It's just getting ridiculous. I think he might even be telling these wild stories to see if he can confuse police.
Malingering is oftentimes a term that we as forensic experts talk about when somebody is lying or fabricating information or feigning symptoms to try and present their reality as something different than it is. While malingering is not an actual diagnosis, you're always assessing for whether there is a motive to fabricate. And in the case of Williams, the motivation's very obvious. He doesn't want to go to prison for killing 2 people. He doesn't want to be seen as somebody who left his son in a home that was on fire to basically burn in the fire and suffocate from smoke inhalation.
She would tell me everything. She told me that she was not her boyfriend, but that she was seeing him, getting to know him, to see if she can move on. His name is Trey, and she was with him last night.
Okay. So she said that she was gonna tell her baby daddy.
She had told him, and he was happy for her. So then, she had told him because I guess she had a picture frame with him, with the boy Trey, her and her son, and he got really upset about it.
She's providing some more of the backstory here, the true backstory. He was jealous. He wanted control over her. For psychopaths like Williams, for their significant other or former significant other, moving on to someone else is sort of like a wound to their ego, and it also is a sense of a loss of control and power over that person. They can't use them and get what they want out of them because somebody else has them. That provides a realistic picture of why Williams might have murdered Diamond.
The demons, he made that up, but all that was a lie.
When we talk about psychopaths and their children, there's a lot of research to suggest that the attachment, if there is one, and sometimes there's not, is very shallow. This is a person or a child who's expendable if it comes to protecting myself. So it's this lack of genuine attachment. But when push comes to shove, Williams will do anything to protect himself, including murdering his son.
The pattern that you see with Larry Williams is one of self-preservation. It's all about him. He's very, very selfish. We know that he has several psychopathic tendencies and traits, such as being manipulative, deceitful, pathological lying, callousness, even superficial charm. These traits, combined with his narcissistic tendencies, is what drives his violence. All of that speaks to someone that has this deeply ingrained dysfunctional pattern of behavioral and cognitive and personality traits, which is essentially a psychopath.
What's wrong with you? Why are you shooting in the air for?
Please?
Yes, ma'am. I need a SAPD at 86. What was it? 86 what? 8605. I caught a guy shooting his automatic.
Okay, and you have that person detained, or?
Yes, I do.
Okay, we'll get somebody out there for you.
10-1, pardon your mess.
Yes, sir. I came downstairs to get a cigarette from one of my neighbors, and she's in a pile of blood, and she's dead.
A crime scene bathed in blood and tears. That's what a police officer said he faced when he arrived at a north side apartment complex.
A call for a shooting sent officers to this apartment complex in the pre-dawn hours on the day after the 4th of July. They were met by a woman and several others, all visibly upset.
I looked down and I saw a small child with a very gruesome head injury. I took several looks back and forth to my left and my right. That's when I saw the male body.
A body later identified as 26-year-old John Bones, the child 2.5-year-old Anika Gass, both shot in the head. In an adjoining room was the body of 26-year-old Courtney Gass, the child's mother, also shot in the head.
Okay, yeah. Okay, doke. Okay. Chris, I don't really know what's going on. In your own words, Christopher, tell me why you're here talking with me today.
What?
Tell me why you're here talking with me today. The officers told me you were shooting a gun outside your apartment. Were you and Courtney arguing?
I remember waking up to her yelling and screaming, and she had my rifle, and she grabbed my rifle, and she was in Annika's room, and she was walking around and being a dumbass.
Here we see Allgood acting like a deer in headlights. He's acting as if he doesn't know what's going on, like he's thrown off by the investigator's question. But he's presenting as if he's somebody who's an innocent bystander, or who knows, maybe even a victim in this situation that he actually created.
What happened after that?
I woke up to all that. I don't know what was going on. I do remember wrestling the gun away from her. And when I walked outside, the officer put his gun to my head, and he told me, drop the gun or whatever. And I was like, what's going on? Wait a minute. I was terrified. I don't know.
So you and Courtney were arguing, and she got your gun out. Did she shoot the gun that you
woke up to this. I don't even know. I don't even know why I'm here.
It looks like Courtney is dead in your apartment, Christopher. And we gotta figure out.
Are you serious?
The superficial nature of Allgood's emotions, the displays of emotion, the sound of emotion, they're inconsistent, they're controlled, they're performative. And what's important to note here is that while there's a high level of emotion, he seems able to turn it on and turn it off as he needs to communicate. And that's just not how traumatized people react. If they're sincere, they don't typically turn on and off like a light switch.
Who else was in the apartment, Chris?
Bones was staying late. Can't come up. We used to play music together a long time ago.
Where is he right now?
What?
Where is Kevin right now?
It was in my daughter's bedroom, but
You're the only one who walked away from that apartment, so you're the only one I can talk to. I need to understand. Your daughter's dead, and Kevin is dead, and Courtney is dead, Chris, and I believe you're the one who killed them.
Can't shoot them, baby. Why'd you do this?
So just because people have psychopathy doesn't mean that they are brilliant at telling a great story and making all the facts line up. So it doesn't make any sense that he would go being from like confused, disoriented, and he has no knowledge of anything. And then we see these moments of clarity where he's doing something very deliberate. He's making sure it sounds like he's still a victim, that he does not know anything, and that Courtney is the one who's committed murder.
Are you trying to tell me that Courtney killed all those people?
I woke up. I had to stop her, that's all I knew.
Into the baby's room. What are you saying, Courtney shot herself? You didn't just wake up and walk outside with a rifle in your hand, Chris. That didn't happen. Start at the beginning and tell me what happened.
I woke up to that, and I heard the bang. I remember waking up and looking at her.
You heard what bang? Are you saying Courtney shot your daughter, Chris? You told me you took the gun away from Courtney, right? You took the gun away from Courtney, but she was still alive, Chris. That's my point to you. After after you shot her,
You're not trying to understand anything. You're trying to push everything on me.
Allgood is getting more and more, animated as time goes on. His voice is rising. He's getting defensive. We see often the individuals with psychopathy start to get angry or frustrated, at least, whenever they're no longer in control, or they start to sense that they're losing control. And I think that's what's happening here with Allgood. He senses that she's not buying his story. She's not trying to understand him. And he's starting to get aggravated.
We've done a gunshot residue on her hands, Chris. She does not have gunshot residue on her hands, so she didn't fire that gun.
When I was trying to take it from her, it did go off, so.
But you didn't bother calling for help. Was your mouth?
No, my dad's been a cop for 16 years. You don't say anything.
When there's 3 dead bodies in your apartment, Chris, you don't mention that to anybody?
Everything you want to, but it's not gonna matter. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not going to do anything wrong. And you're gonna put me in jail for trying to be the bigger man and try to do the right thing. The only reason why I lied to you at first was because I didn't want her to seem like she was a
The resounding reality is that Allgood is trying to manage impressions. He's trying to control the narrative that this detective has about who he is as a person. He's throwing anything and everything against the wall to try and gain credibility. He's telling her he's the child of law enforcement. He's telling her that he lied, and somehow by admitting to a lie up front, that means he's really a truthful person because he's willing to tell on himself. These various versions of him trying to control how they see him as a suspect is nothing other than his own willingness to lie chronically and habitually without thinking about the consequences of what he's saying, that it can be disproven, that it's inconsistent with what he said 5 minutes before. And when he's confronted consistently about the lies and the mistruths, he becomes more and more glib and grandiose.
I sat on the porch for a little bit. Everything was cool, and then I remember hearing a gunshot. I went back in, and...
Okay, you heard a gunshot, you went back in. So now, you may or may not have heard a gunshot that woke you up, but...
I didn't want to say that before, man. I remember coming back in, and I grabbed the gun away from her, and I couldn't believe this that was going on, and the cops had already got there. I remember coming back outside.
With the gun in your hand, giving me 3 different versions of what happened.
I didn't give you 3.
Yes, you did.
I'm not getting blamed.
The truth. You are getting blamed for it because you did it. I'm just trying to understand why you did it, Chris.
That's justice to the American populace. You're actually guilty until proven innocent.
Despite this insurmountable evidence that's piling up against him, Allgood is almost doubling down. He's tripling down and saying, no, no, no. It's a very unsophisticated approach to engaging with humans and to accepting responsibility. And in this case, he's failing to accept responsibility, and he's doing so in any manner he can think of.
Your girlfriend has a gunshot wound to the head, okay? That's from the side. She couldn't have put that rifle to her head and pulled the trigger. The angle is impossible.
The witnesses didn't hear 2 gunshots and then a pause while you had time to wrestle with Courtney over the gun and then the gun accidentally going off. There was no break between the 3 gunshots. You want me to believe she just got up and decided to shoot your daughter for no reason. See, that's what you want me to believe.
But you don't.
How ridiculous is that? How ridiculous is that?
It's probably been something coming one time.
But for some reason, this time, this night, something was different. Something happened.
Everything, we've been fine. Everything has been...
But, okay.
Everything's been fine right now.
Evidently not, because she's dead. So we didn't get over everything. Everything was not fine. Don't try to sell that to me. Everything was not fine.
I'm not trying to sell you anything.
He's being a little bit honest. He's opening up. I think that's to create the impression of, well, he is being honest. He's a little vulnerable. There might be something sympathetic here. He might have been victimized in some way, right? I think it's still in the big picture purpose of trying to manipulate the interviewers to get them away from the hostile view of him to something that's more sympathetic.
You told me earlier that you guys wrestled with the gun and it accidentally went off. That's what you told me earlier.
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, you did.
No, you were trying to get me to say that, and I told you.
No, I asked you if that...
I would not have said something like that.
You've not cried for this baby one time, Chris. No, you've been crying for yourself. You've not been crying for this baby. Everything that you've said here today has been self-serving. It's all about you. It's all about you since you walked into the door. That's why you're willing to blame a murder victim for what happened.
She tried to stab me. I did shoot her. I'm sorry. Sorry for lying to you. I don't give a about me. I just didn't want her like that. Sorry. I felt like I had to do what I had to do. I didn't know what else to do. But yeah, but she tried to stab me. I've let her beat my ass before, and I felt like I deserved it. I don't even know why. I've always been selfless like that, man.
So he's not able to intimidate the detective into agreeing to his view of reality. So he morphs his strategy a little bit, and then he finally goes, okay, yeah, so I did shoot her, but she came at me with the knife. Psychopaths, the manipulative part is gaslighting other people and controlling how they view things. So you have to remember, this is not a man who's deep in mourning and in psychological distress about that. This is a man who knows he's in the room, and he's got to figure out how to play the odds as best as he can to get the best outcome he can get from the detective.
She didn't come at you with a knife. What did she do?
Yes, she did. And she had it at my throat at one point. And then we calmed the down, and I thought everything was okay. And then she started back up again because of the whole, if I get a job, she doesn't want me to work certain hours. And I'm like, I gotta get a job no matter what, okay? Every time we got into an argument, I can't conduct my own business with, we have females and people that come in and record and sing and stuff, and she gets so jealous, like and that's how it all started.
Chris, what I'm trying to get you to understand is we sat here and believed you about everything that you're telling us, but when we point out facts to you, you come up with a story like this that makes no sense. But do you see how ridiculous this sounds?
No. I can understand why, but I'm telling you.
I mean, if you remember doing this, did you do anything with fine motor skills? No. Until I bring up the fact that there's an inconsistency in your story, and then you change.
I didn't even mean to shoot her.
I ain't rubbing it in. I'm trying to make a point. You had to wrestle her out of your daughter's room with a gun. And you didn't go back and check it.
It's all horrible. I'm a bad dad, isn't it?
It's either that or you're a murderer.
What we know from a review of the record is that there is some indication and evidence that Courtney actually was getting ready to leave and take their toddler daughter with her. So something happened in that apartment that led to Allgood's ego being bruised. He was somehow humiliated, he was confronted, something happened that caused him to flip. And when he flipped, it became about him versus the world. Him being a father didn't matter. His daughter didn't take priority over his needs. And when you see narcissistic individuals like that, they can't handle rejection. They can't handle their ego being wounded. And so they don't have any choice but to annihilate the source of that wound.
Christopher Allgood is on trial for murder. Prosecutors say they will show expert testimony later in the trial, proving that Allgood's fingerprints were on the trigger of the assault rifle, a rifle they say was used to kill all 3 victims.
Do you want to die? Do you want to die?
He cocked the gun and pushed the gun up against my face and said, I'm going to splatter your brains out all over this room, and I'm not going to go back. I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to kill myself because I'm never going to go back to jail again.
Standing there with him holding me with the knife up against my stomach like that, he proceeded to grab me and hold a knife to my throat. And I started screaming at that point because I was very scared.
We know that Allgood's history of domestic violence is well established. He spent 10 days in jail for pleading no contest to terrorist threats. In 2003, while the charges were dropped.
At 6:42 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet London flat, the kind of ringing that feels too loud for the hour, too sharp for a street that hadn't fully woken yet. And by the time the receiver was lifted, the damage was already done, because somewhere between the last street lamp flickering off and the first bus groaning down the road, a woman had vanished, and the city didn't know it yet, but it was about to carry that absence like a scar for decades. The door to the flat was unlocked, the kettle still warm, a mug half full on the counter, lipstick smudged on the rim like a frozen moment that refused to move forward. And in the bedroom the bed was made, too neatly made, as if someone had left in a hurry but wanted to pretend they hadn't. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no blood, just silence pressed flat against the walls, and a feeling that something had slipped through the cracks while everyone was asleep. Her name would be printed later in block capitals, stretched across tabloids and whispered in pubs, but that morning she was just a missing woman, 29 years old, commuting distance to the city, friendly enough to be recognized by the newsagent, quiet enough to be overlooked by most of the street, living in a row of identical houses where everyone nodded hello and no one really knew anyone at all. The neighbors would say they heard nothing. No scream. No argument. No footsteps on the stairs. Just the ordinary hum of London breathing in the dark. And that would be the first shock because people expect crimes to announce themselves, to arrive with noise and violence, but this one arrived like a held breath that never let go. By midday, police cars lined the street, blue and white cutting through the grayness, officers moving in and out of the building with notebooks and cameras, gloved hands hovering over doorknobs and light switches, documenting a life interrupted. They photographed the mug. They bagged the bedsheets. They measured the distance from the front door to the stairwell, from the stairwell to the pavement outside. They asked the neighbors the same questions over and over again, voices polite, methodical, already rehearsed. When did you last see her? Did she seem upset? Did she mention anyone? Did you notice anything unusual? And each answer fell into the same empty space, a hollow echo that offered nothing solid to hold on to. The street itself became a character in the story almost immediately. Its narrowness, its sameness, the way the houses pressed against each other like secrets too close for comfort. Reporters arrived before the sun had fully set. Cameras pointed at front doors, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak, and the phrase mysterious disappearance began to circulate, sticky and sensational, attaching itself to every update. London had seen disappearances before, but something about this one felt different, wrong in a way that was hard to articulate, a sense that the answer wasn't far away but somehow completely hidden. Detectives worked through the night, tracing her last known movements, a routine commute, a stop at the corner shop, a brief conversation with the clerk about the weather, a mundane life mapped out in receipts and recollections. There was no record of her leaving the building after she came home. No CCTV on the street. No witnesses stepping forward. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the air between her front door and her bed. The phrase locked room mystery began to appear in internal notes, not as a dramatic flourish but as a genuine problem, because the evidence refused to arrange itself into anything coherent. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation widened, then stretched thin. Her photograph stared out from missing person posters taped to bus stops and shop windows, her eyes following commuters who slowed down for half a second before moving on. Volunteers searched parks and alleyways, riverbanks and abandoned lots, their footsteps crunching over debris and disappointment. Each search ended the same way, with tired faces and empty hands, the silence growing heavier every time. The community oscillated between fear and fascination, doors locked earlier, curtains drawn tighter, conversations lowering in volume when strangers passed by. The press fed on the uncertainty, speculating openly, hinting at secret lovers, hidden debts, double lives, every rumor given just enough oxygen to stay alive. Friends were scrutinized. Colleagues were questioned. Family members were asked to perform their grief on camera, to plead directly to the person who might be watching, listening, smiling somewhere in the dark. And always hovering over every headline was that phrase, cold case. Whispered like a curse even before the case had officially gone cold, a premonition more than a label. Inside the police station, the mood shifted from urgency to frustration. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, most vague, some bizarre, all demanding time that was already running out. A man claimed he saw her arguing with someone on the street. Another insisted she boarded a late-night bus heading out of the city. A woman swore she saw her days later in a cafe miles away. Each lead was chased, documented, dismissed. Files grew thicker. Answers did not. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the case slipped from the front pages to the inside columns, from daily updates to occasional mentions, until one morning it wasn't mentioned at all. Years passed. The street changed. New tenants moved in. Old ones moved out. Fresh paint covered old doorways. Children who had been toddlers when the police first arrived grew tall enough to read the faded headlines in old newspaper clippings. The case was officially labeled unsolved, the file boxed up and stored, the detectives reassigned, retirement looming for some, memories blurring at the edges. But the absence remained, a ghost threaded through the history of the place, resurfacing every anniversary, every time a similar story broke somewhere else. And then, decades later, a name resurfaced, quietly at first, in a review of old evidence prompted by new forensic techniques, a routine re-examination that almost didn't happen, a cold case team sifting through boxes that smelled of dust and time. It started with something small, a detail overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, something that didn't fit then and didn't fit now. A neighbor's statement, a timeline that was too neat, a presence that had been accepted without question. The realization didn't arrive like a revelation. It crept in slowly, painfully, like light leaking under a closed door. Because sometimes the most dangerous place isn't the dark alley or the empty street, but the space right next to you, the wall you share, the door you pass every day without thinking. And as the investigators leaned closer to the past, piecing together fragments of a life interrupted, one thought began to dominate the room, heavy and inescapable, a thought that would soon shock a city that believed it had already mourned, that the truth might have been living next door all along. The review began without ceremony, no dramatic announcement, just a pair of detectives in a windowless room turning pages that had not been touched in years, the paper brittle, the ink slightly faded, the past resisting inspection. Cold cases have a smell to them, a mixture of dust and failure, and this one was no different, yet something about it refused to stay quiet, a tension embedded in the margins, in the underlined sentences, in the pauses where notes should have been. The official timeline lay neatly arranged at the front of the file, a clean sequence of events that looked convincing from a distance, but the closer they leaned in, the more it began to feel like a story told too smoothly, a version of reality sanded down until it no longer cut. They started where every disappearance starts again, with the last confirmed sighting, the corner shop, the brief exchange about the weather, the timestamp on the receipt. It had been accepted as solid, reliable, a fixed point in an otherwise drifting narrative, but now it was read with different eyes. The clerk's statement was confident, almost rehearsed, his memory oddly precise about the time yet vague about everything else. He remembered the rain, remembered the coin she used to pay, remembered her smile, but not what she wore, not whether she seemed rushed, not whether anyone waited outside. It was the kind of memory shaped by repetition, by retelling, by years of being asked the same questions until the answers settled into something safe. From there the trail went dark. No witnesses. No cameras. No confirmed movements. The investigators mapped the street again, this time not as a crime scene but as a lived space, considering lines of sight, patterns of daily routine, the rhythm of neighbors coming and going. In 1987, the street had been quieter, less transient, people more rooted, more observant in theory, yet the statements collected back then read like a chorus of non-observations. Everyone had been home. Everyone had heard nothing. Everyone had seen nothing unusual. It was statistically improbable, the kind of unanimity that raises more questions than it answers. One statement buried deep in the file began to draw attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so aggressively normal. A neighbor from the adjoining flat, interviewed twice in the first week, then never again. He reported hearing the usual sounds that night: a door closing, footsteps on the stairs, nothing worth mentioning. He described the missing woman as polite, quiet, someone who kept to herself. He had an alibi, a routine evening at home, television, and early night. It was all there, tidy, unremarkable, and perhaps because of that, it had slipped through the cracks of suspicion, filed away under cleared and forgotten. As the cold case team dug deeper, they noticed patterns that hadn't been obvious before. The neighbor's timeline matched the official version almost too perfectly, aligning with assumed times rather than independently verifiable ones. His statements mirrored details released to the press, suggesting his memory might have been influenced by what he'd read rather than what he'd witnessed. It wasn't evidence, not yet, just friction, a sense that something didn't glide as smoothly as it should. They cross-referenced old interviews with newer information, tracking where people had ended up, who had moved away, who had stayed, who had died. The street had changed hands many times, but that adjoining flat had an unusually stable history. He had lived there longer than anyone else, before the disappearance and long after, a constant presence in a place defined by turnover. Stability can look like innocence, but it can also look like opportunity, a way to blend into the background so completely that no one thinks to look twice. The investigators revisited the physical evidence, what little there was. Fibers from the carpet. A partial fingerprint smudged beyond use. Items that had once promised answers but delivered nothing. Technology had advanced, but absence is hard to test, and most of what mattered had never been collected in the first place. No sign of a struggle meant no blood. No forced entry meant no broken locks. The scene had been too clean, too controlled, suggesting not spontaneity but familiarity. Someone who didn't need to break in. Someone who knew the layout, the routines, the blind spots. They spoke to people who had known her, now older, more cautious, their memories softened by time. A friend recalled her mentioning the walls were thin, that she sometimes heard voices late at night, muffled conversations she couldn't quite place. At the time it had seemed trivial, a throwaway comment about shared living spaces in an old building. Now it was written down again, underlined, circled. A small note that hummed with new meaning. Thin walls meant sound traveled. Thin walls meant proximity. Thin walls meant someone could listen without being seen. The case began to attract quiet interest within the department, not the media frenzy of the early days but something more focused, more dangerous, because it threatened to expose how easily assumptions had calcified into conclusions. Revisiting a cold case is an admission that the past might still be wrong, and that kind of doubt can spread quickly. Senior officers cautioned restraint. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no body, just a feeling, an accumulation of inconsistencies that pointed in a direction no one had seriously considered before. They re-interviewed the neighbor, now older, his hair thinner, his manner still calm. He welcomed them in, offered tea, joked about the street, about how long it had been since all the fuss. His recollection hadn't changed much over the years, which could have been a sign of truth or of rehearsal. When asked about that night, he repeated the same phrases, the same sequence, as if reading from an internal script. He denied hearing anything unusual, denied any close relationship, denied even noticing when she stopped appearing. It was all denial without defensiveness, a performance so smooth it was almost convincing. But something else had changed. Where earlier interviews had shown him eager to cooperate, now there were pauses, fractions of a second where his eyes flicked away, moments when he asked for questions to be repeated. Stress, age, the discomfort of dredging up the past, all reasonable explanations, yet the detectives felt the air in the room tighten. They weren't looking for a confession, they were listening for cracks. Outside, the community remained largely unaware that anything was stirring. To them, the case was history, a tragedy folded into the city's long memory of unsolved crimes. But within the investigation, the word solved began to appear cautiously, not as a declaration but as a hypothesis, a dangerous one, because solving a case like this meant accepting that the threat had never been external, never some shadowy stranger passing through, but something embedded, domestic, right next door. It meant rewriting the story from the inside out. As the detectives left the flat that day, stepping back onto the familiar pavement, they looked again at the buildings, at the shared walls, the aligned windows, the way lives overlapped without truly touching. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and unsettling, that the disappearance might not have been a mystery of distance or chance, but of proximity and patience. And if that was true, then the most terrifying part of the case wasn't what had happened in 1987, but how easily it had been missed, how completely it had hidden in plain sight, waiting for time itself to loosen its grip on the truth. The next crack in the story didn't come from a revelation, but from a recalculation, a quiet reworking of time itself, because when investigators stopped treating the original timeline as sacred and began to pull it apart minute by minute, the night of the disappearance started to breathe differently. They reconstructed the hours not as a straight line but as overlapping currents, neighbors settling in for the evening, televisions flickering behind curtains, pipes groaning in the walls, the building alive in its own subtle way. And in that reconstruction, the assumed window of opportunity widened, stretching far beyond what had once seemed reasonable. The official version said she came home, made tea, went to bed. Simple. Comfortable. But the mug in the kitchen told a stranger story. It wasn't empty. It wasn't cold when found. The milk inside hadn't curdled. At the time, it had been logged and dismissed as inconclusive, but now, with better understanding of cooling rates and environmental factors, it suggested she had been interrupted shortly after pouring it, not hours later, not in the middle of the night, but early, when the building was still awake, when sounds would have blended into the ordinary noise of shared living. That narrowed the focus back to the building itself. If something happened then, someone should have noticed. Unless they mistook it for something else. Unless the sound of a door opening wasn't alarming because doors opened all the time. Unless footsteps on the stairs didn't register because they were expected. Familiarity, the investigators realized, was the greatest camouflage of all. They revisited statements with that in mind, especially those from residents who had lived closest to her. One remembered hearing voices but assuming it was the television. Another recalled a thud, written off as someone dropping something. A third mentioned the pipes banging unusually loud that night, a detail no one had followed up on. In isolation, each memory was meaningless. Together, they formed a low, indistinct hum, a suggestion that something had happened, not explosively, not dramatically, but just enough to ripple through the thin walls and then disappear. Attention returned, inevitably, to the adjoining flat. The shared wall became a point of obsession, diagrams sketched and resketched. Sound tests conducted years later to understand how noise traveled through that old structure. What they found was unsettling. A raised voice carried clearly. A struggle might not sound like a struggle at all, just furniture shifting, muffled impacts, the kind of disturbance easily misinterpreted by someone half listening while absorbed in their own life. They examined the neighbor's routine more closely, not just that night, but the pattern of his days around it. He had taken time off work shortly after the disappearance, citing illness. At the time it had meant nothing. People get sick. People take leave. But placed against the timeline, it suggested stress, disruption, a break in normal behavior. Financial records showed nothing unusual. No sudden trips. No purchases that stood out. It was the absence of anomalies that began to feel deliberate. Investigators spoke again to people who had known him, colleagues, acquaintances, anyone willing to talk. The descriptions were consistent. Quiet, private, helpful when asked, invisible when not. No history of violence. Nook implants. The kind of man neighbors feel safe around precisely because there is nothing to point at. Yet one former coworker hesitated, then mentioned something odd, a habit of watching rather than participating, of knowing details about people he barely interacted with. At the time it had been brushed off as awkwardness. Now it was logged as awareness, attentiveness, the kind that can slide into fixation without warning. The absence of a body remained the central problem, the void around which everything else circled. Without it, the case was always one step removed from certainty, forever flirting with the line between suspicion and proof. The original searches had been extensive but limited by the technology and assumptions of the time. Now, decades later, the landscape had changed beyond recognition. New buildings stood where empty lots once were. The river had been dredged and redredged. If she had been moved, concealed, disposed of, the opportunity had been endless. And yet, something nagged at the detectives, a resistance to the idea that the answer lay far away. Crimes of proximity tend to end nearby. They are about convenience, not logistics. The theory began to form, unspoken at first, that whatever had happened hadn't required a car, a long journey, or elaborate planning. It had required access, privacy, and time. All things readily available to someone next door. They reviewed old search maps, noting areas that had been dismissed early, spaces considered too obvious, too exposed to hide anything successfully. Basements. Shared storage areas. Crawl spaces sealed and forgotten as regulations changed. In the 1980s, record-keeping for such spaces had been lax, renovations poorly documented, alterations made without permits. A building could swallow secrets and never register the loss. When they returned to the property with fresh eyes, it wasn't with search warrants or dogs, but with questions probing the history of the structure itself. Renovations had occurred in the early 1990s, shortly after the case went cold. Walls had been reinforced, flooring replaced. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious on paper, but the timing sat uneasily alongside everything else. Renovations are common. So is the urge to change a space that holds bad memories. The neighbor, when asked about the work, shrugged it off as routine maintenance. Old buildings need attention. Floors rot. Walls crack. His answers were reasonable, unremarkable. Yet the detectives noticed how quickly he steered the conversation away, how he deflected with humor, with irritation, with sudden fatigue. Again, nothing definitive. Just texture, accumulating layer by layer. The case began to take on a new shape, less about a single moment of violence and more about a slow tightening of circumstances, a convergence of opportunity and secrecy. The idea that the truth had been close enough to touch all along settled heavily on everyone involved. It reframed the years of silence not as emptiness, but as containment, a secret held within a few square meters of brick and plaster, aging alongside the city. As the investigation pushed forward, word began to leak, carefully, selectively. A cold case under review. New lines of inquiry. No official statements, but enough to stir old anxieties. Journalists sniffed around again, sensing movement, and the phrase "suspect was living next door" appeared tentatively in whispers. Not yet headlines, but the impact was immediate. People revisited their memories, questioned their assumptions, wondered how well they truly knew the people closest to them. For the detectives, the pressure mounted because suspicion without proof is a dangerous thing. To be wrong would mean reopening wounds for nothing. To be right would mean acknowledging that a predator had lived undetected for decades, shielded by normalcy and time. As they stood once more on that familiar street, watching lights flicker on behind curtains, the weight of the unanswered question pressed in, sharper than ever, because the closer they came to an answer, the more they understood what was at stake, not just for the case, but for the fragile belief that evil announces itself, that it can't sit quietly next door, waiting for everyone else to stop looking. What finally shifted the case from theory to threat wasn't a new discovery, but an old oversight dragged into the light, a document misfiled, misread, quietly ignored because it didn't fit the shape investigators had expected back then. It was a maintenance log from the council, dated just weeks after the disappearance, noting a complaint about a persistent smell in the building, described vaguely as damp, decay, something organic that came and went. The complaint had been closed without action, attributed to plumbing issues common in old properties. No follow-up. No inspection. Another line crossed out and forgotten. In the context of a missing person, it was chilling. Smells tell stories that paperwork tries to bury. They linger, they fade, they return when conditions are right. The detectives stared at the log for a long time, aware of how thin the line was between coincidence and consequence. Old buildings smell. Old pipes leak. But the timing was wrong, and timing in a case like this is never just timing. They dug deeper into the building's records, combing through council archives, handwritten notes, microfilm reels that hummed softly as they scrolled. What emerged was a portrait of neglect and improvisation. Repairs done cheaply, walls opened and closed without much oversight, spaces repurposed and forgotten. One note mentioned access to a crawl space between the two flats, sealed during later renovations. Another referenced complaints about noise traveling too easily through the shared wall, prompting additional insulation years after the disappearance. Insulation added not just for comfort, but for quiet. The detectives requested permission to inspect the property again, this time more thoroughly. The request alone was enough to send a ripple through the department. Inspections lead to questions. Questions lead to answers people may not want. The neighbor, now firmly in the frame, reacted with visible irritation, citing inconvenience, age, his right to privacy. His resistance was measured, polite, but firm enough to register. Innocent people resist too, the investigators reminded themselves. No one likes the past knocking on their door. When access was finally granted, it wasn't dramatic. No crowds. No cameras. Just a small team moving slowly through a familiar space, measuring, tapping, listening. The flat looked ordinary, lived in but sparse, furniture arranged carefully, walls recently painted. Too recently, perhaps. They noted the smell of cleaning products, sharp and persistent, clinging to the air in a way that felt defensive. Cleanliness can be comfort. It can also be camouflage. They focused on the shared wall, running hands along it, noting slight inconsistencies in thickness, areas where the sound changed when tapped. Behind a wardrobe, the plaster felt newer. Not suspicious by itself. People patch walls all the time. But when matched against renovation dates and the crawl space mentioned in old records, it began to form a pattern. A small one. A dangerous one. Ground-penetrating radar was discussed, then dismissed as impractical without stronger justification. Warrants require certainty, and certainty was still just out of reach. What they did instead was ask questions, careful ones, about the renovations, about who had done the work, what had been changed, what had been sealed. The neighbor's answers were vague now, less precise than before. His memory suddenly unreliable when specifics were required. Contractors long gone. Receipts lost. Time blurring details. The same man who remembered the night of the disappearance with uncanny clarity now struggled to recall years of construction work. Outside the building, the story was beginning to take shape in the public imagination. The words cold case and next door were no longer whispered. They were printed, broadcast, dissected by commentators who smelled blood in the water. The community reacted with a mix of denial and dread. Some defended the neighbor fiercely, pointing to his years of quiet living, his helpfulness, his apparent normality. Others recoiled, replaying every interaction, every shared smile, wondering what had been hidden behind it. The pressure on the investigation intensified. Every move was scrutinized, every leak criticized. The detectives felt the weight of decades pressing down on them, the knowledge that if they were wrong, they would destroy what little peace remained for everyone involved. But if they were right, then peace had been an illusion all along, maintained by ignorance rather than safety. They returned again to the idea of opportunity. The neighbor's access to her flat wasn't just theoretical. Old testimony revealed that he had helped her once with a faulty lock. A small favor that placed him inside her space, aware of its layout, its vulnerabilities. At the time, it had been noted as neighborly. Now it was logged differently. Familiarity changes meaning when viewed through the lens of disappearance. Another overlooked detail resurfaced, this one from a witness who had moved away shortly after the incident. She had reported hearing raised voices that evening, a man and a woman, arguing softly, urgently. She hadn't recognized the voices. She hadn't been sure which flat they came from. When she mentioned it, she'd been told it was probably a television. She accepted that explanation because it was easier. Most people do. The detectives tracked her down, now living hundreds of miles away, her memory hesitant but intact. When asked to describe the voices, she paused, then said something that shifted the room. The man's voice, she said, sounded close, not echoing down the stairwell, not distant but right there, as if the wall itself was speaking. A shared wall. A private argument mistaken for background noise. With that, the theory hardened. The disappearance wasn't a sudden snatching, not a dramatic abduction from the street. It was something that unfolded quietly, indoors, contained, perhaps accidental at first, escalating beyond control. Accidents don't announce themselves either. They get hidden. They get managed. They get buried under layers of normal life and fresh paint. The neighbor was interviewed again, this time under more direct questioning. His composure cracked just enough to notice, sweat beading at his temples, irritation slipping into anger when the shared wall was mentioned, when renovations were brought up, when the idea of proximity was pressed. He denied everything categorically, his voice rising despite his efforts to keep it steady. He accused the police of harassment, of chasing ghosts, of ruining lives for headlines. The words were sharp, rehearsed, defensive. Afterward, one of the detectives wrote a single line in the case notes. Subject reacts emotionally to structural questions. It wasn't proof. It was a signal. As the investigation edged closer to action, the sense of inevitability grew. Something was going to break one way or another. Either the theory would collapse under its own weight, or the building would give up what it had been holding for so long. The street, unchanged in its quiet rhythm, watched without knowing, unaware that beneath its familiar surfaces, beneath walls that had heard everything and said nothing, the past was beginning to stir, restless, impatient, no longer content to remain sealed away. The warrant came through on a gray morning that flattened the city, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished, provisional, as if London itself were holding its breath. It wasn't a dramatic document, just pages of careful language, probabilities stacked on probabilities, enough to justify a deeper look without promising what that look might find. The detectives read it twice, aware that this was the point of no return. Once you open walls, you can't close them again, not in the minds of the people who live behind them. They arrived without sirens, without spectacle, a deliberate choice, vans parked a street away, officers moving with quiet efficiency. The neighbor watched from his doorway, his expression tight, controlled, the performance of indignation already in place. He complained about disruption, about noise, about his rights. He did not ask what they were looking for. That omission did not go unnoticed. Inside, the flat was cleared room by room. Furniture shifted, personal items boxed and labeled. The air felt heavier than before, thick with anticipation and the chemical tang of cleaning agents that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Forensic specialists marked sections of the shared wall with chalk, guided by old blueprints and new measurements, by intuition honed on cases where intuition had been all that remained. The first cuts into the plaster were tentative, controlled. Dust fell in soft clouds, coating the floor, settling on everything. There was nothing at first. Just brick. Just insulation. Just the dull thud of material giving way. The neighbor stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, watching too closely, his eyes tracking every movement. Innocent people watch too, the detectives reminded themselves. They watch because it's their home being dismantled. But they don't usually watch like this. As the opening widened, the smell changed. It wasn't sudden, not overpowering, but distinct enough to register. An undernote beneath the dust, something stale and wrong. The team paused. Ventilation was adjusted. Masks were secured. Someone muttered that old buildings hold all kinds of odors. Another said nothing at all, already writing the moment into memory. Behind the plaster, they found a void. A narrow space between walls that shouldn't have been there according to the most recent plans, a relic of older construction methods, later sealed and forgotten. It was just large enough for a person to crouch, too small to stand comfortably. A hidden space not designed for living, but perfect for hiding something no one was meant to find. They widened the opening carefully, lights probing the darkness. Dust motes danced in the beam, revealing debris, discarded materials, the detritus of decades. And then there was fabric, folded or pushed into a corner, its color dulled beyond recognition. The room went silent in the way it only does when everyone understands the same thing at the same time. The neighbor's reaction was immediate. He stepped forward, then stopped, his face draining of color, his mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. He said it was rubbish. Old insulation. Someone else's mess. His voice was too loud, too fast, words tumbling over each other in a rush that felt rehearsed, and yet completely uncontrolled. Forensics took over, methodical, precise. The fabric was documented, photographed, gently removed. Beneath it, more items emerged, personal effects that had once been catalogued as missing, now resurfacing with a terrible clarity. A shoe. A fragment of jewelry. Objects that had lived for years in the abstract, in lists and descriptions now present, undeniable. The neighbor began to shout, accusations spilling out, claims of planted evidence, of conspiracies, of persecution stretching back decades. He did not cry. He did not ask questions. He demanded. The building itself seemed to react, groaning softly as if resentful of the intrusion, old beams settling, dust continuing to fall long after the tools stopped. Officers secured the site, extending the search to adjacent spaces, documenting everything. The shared wall had been altered more extensively than records suggested, reinforced, sealed in ways that required effort and intent. This was not an accident of architecture. It was a decision. Outside, the street filled despite efforts to contain it. Phones were out. Whispers spread. The phrase cold case leapt from mouth to mouth, now paired with solved, the word landing with a thud that echoed through the crowd. Reporters arrived, cameras rolling, speculation already crystallizing into narrative. The idea that the suspect had been living next door was no longer theory. It was reality unfolding in real time. The neighbor was taken aside, read his rights, his protests growing shriller as the weight of the moment pressed in. He claimed he had nothing to do with it, that the space predated him, that anyone could have used it. When asked why he had renovated the wall, why he had sealed it so thoroughly, his answers unraveled into contradictions, timelines shifting, details changing. Stress does that, his lawyer would later argue. Stress makes people forget. Stress makes people defensive. Stress also reveals where the pressure points are. As evidence was catalogued and removed, the detectives felt a strange, hollow satisfaction, the kind that comes not with triumph but with grim confirmation. Finding something is not the same as understanding it. Objects tell you what was there, not how it happened, not why. The absence that had haunted the case for decades now had edges, shape, weight. But the story behind it remained stubbornly incomplete. Forensic tests were ordered immediately, every item handled as if it might still whisper something useful. DNA, fibers, traces of skin, of hair, of anything that could anchor the past to the present with scientific certainty. Time complicates everything. Decay erases details. Contamination blurs lines. The investigators knew that even now, with a hidden space opened and secrets spilling out, the case could still slip through their fingers. The neighbor was released pending further questioning, the decision sparking outrage and fear in equal measure. To some, it was proof of a system too cautious, too slow. To others, it was a reminder that suspicion is not guilt, that even the most disturbing discoveries require careful handling. He returned briefly to the street under watch, his presence now radioactive, neighbors avoiding his gaze, doors closing quickly as he passed. That night the building stood exposed, its insides laid bare, lights burning late as teams worked through the hours. The shared wall, once an unremarkable boundary between lives, now felt like an accusation, a line that had been crossed in ways no one wanted to imagine. For the detectives, sleep was impossible. They replayed every decision, every assumption made over the years, every moment when the truth had been close enough to touch and yet ignored. By morning, the story had gone global. Headlines screamed about a cold case solved, about a suspect next door, about the horror hidden in plain sight. But inside the investigation, no one used the word solved. Not yet, because for every answer uncovered, new questions rose to take its place, darker and more complex. What exactly had happened that night? How quickly things had gone wrong? Whether anyone else had known, suspected, chosen to look away. The wall had given up its secret, but the silence around it still loomed, heavy and unresolved, and as the city woke to the shock of what had been found, the investigators understood that the most difficult part was still ahead, turning evidence into truth, turning suspicion into proof, and confronting the possibility that even now, after all this time, The full story might remain just out of reach, sealed not behind plaster, but behind the limits of what anyone was willing to see. The lab became the new battleground, a place of sterile light and controlled patience, where the past was coaxed into speaking through fragments and traces too small to see with the naked eye. Evidence arrived in sealed bags, each one carrying the weight of decades, handled by technicians who understood that time was both enemy and ally. Degradation blurs, but it also preserves in strange ways, sealing moments in darkness where they wait to be disturbed. DNA was the first hope and the first disappointment. Some samples yielded profiles too partial to stand on their own, others contaminated by years of dust and human contact. Still, patterns emerged, faint but persistent, enough to suggest proximity, handling repeated contact. The shoe carried fibers that matched the carpeting in the adjoining flat, not conclusively, but closely enough to keep the theory alive. The jewelry bore microscopic scratches consistent with being pressed against brick, not dropped casually, not lost but wedged, forced into a space that resisted. Investigators reconstructed the hidden void digitally, mapping its dimensions, calculating how long it would take to modify the wall, to conceal items without drawing attention. The work would have required tools, time, confidence that no one would interrupt. That confidence only comes from familiarity, from knowing who is home, who is not, from understanding the rhythms of a building the way one understands their own pulse. This wasn't the act of a passerby. It was the act of someone settled, rooted, unafraid. They turned again to the night itself, reimagining it with new constraints. If the confrontation happened early, as the mug suggested, then the building was active, not asleep. Sounds would blend, interruptions possible. That implied urgency, a need to resolve the situation quickly, quietly. The working theory shifted from premeditation to escalation, from a plan to a mistake managed after the fact. Accidents don't erase themselves. People do. The neighbor was brought in again, this time with counsel present, the room smaller, the air thicker. He listened as the evidence was outlined, his expression fixed, jaw clenched, eyes occasionally flicking to the table as if it might offer an escape route. When asked about the items found in the wall, he repeated his earlier claims, that the space predated him, that anyone could have accessed it, that he had no knowledge of what lay behind the plaster. His lawyer spoke often, carefully, steering answers away from specifics. But when questioned about the shoe, about its size, its brand, something shifted. The neighbor hesitated, corrected himself mid-sentence, then laughed it off as nerves. It was a small moment, easily dismissed, but it lodged itself in the detectives' minds. People who are innocent make mistakes. People who are lying make adjustments. The trick is knowing which is which. They pressed on, asking about his relationship with the missing woman. He minimized it, described it as distant, polite. When confronted with evidence that he had been inside her flat, he reframed it as a single, forgettable incident, a neighborly favor blown out of proportion. His voice tightened when asked why he had never mentioned it before. He said he hadn't thought it important. The room absorbed the lie without comment. Outside the station, the narrative hardened. The public wanted certainty, a villain, a conclusion that would justify the years of fear and fascination. Commentators spoke with confidence about guilt, about monsters hiding in plain sight. Others cautioned restraint, reminding audiences of miscarriages of justice, of how easily suspicion can become spectacle. The investigation existed in that uncomfortable space between, pulled by gravity from both sides. The detectives returned to the building, not to search but to listen. They spoke with neighbors who had avoided them before, now eager to unburden themselves. Stories emerged, not of violence but of discomfort, of moments that hadn't seemed significant until now. A stare held too long, a question that felt intrusive, a sense of being watched that had been laughed off as paranoia. None of it was proof. All of it was context. One neighbor recalled a night, months after the disappearance, when work had been done late, drilling sounds muffled but persistent, the kind of noise you tolerate because it's easier than complaining. Another remembered the neighbor carrying heavy bags down the stairs, joking about clearing out junk. At the time it had meant nothing. Memory is a malleable thing, shaped by what comes after, but patterns began to form, overlapping accounts sketching the outline of behavior that had gone unremarked because it had never crossed into the dramatic. The legal team warned the detectives about confirmation bias, about the danger of fitting every detail into a single narrative. They were right to do so. The case needed more than atmosphere and inference. It needed a hinge, a moment that connected the evidence to intent, to action. Without it, the wall could be explained away as coincidence, the items as planted, the smell as plumbing. Doubt is resilient. Then a call came from the lab, not triumphant but cautious. One of the samples had produced a partial mitochondrial DNA match, consistent with maternal lineage traced through a distant relative of the missing woman. It wasn't the kind of result that closed cases on its own, but it anchored the items to her in a way that could not be easily dismissed. The hidden space had held something of her. Not just objects but traces of presence. The detectives felt the shift, subtle but decisive. The case leaned forward. They requested additional warrants, broader searches, financial records re-examined with fresh parameters. They scrutinized the neighbor's movements in the years following the disappearance, his routines unchanged, his life remarkably static. No sudden relocations, no breakdowns, just a quiet continuity that now felt less like stability and more like control. In the interview room, they changed tactics, moving away from confrontation and toward narrative, inviting him to talk, to fill the silence. He spoke of loneliness, of how buildings bring people close without making them known, of misunderstandings that spiral. He never confessed. He never admitted. But he circled the idea of accidents, of moments that can't be undone, of the burden of living with something no one else knows. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The detectives listened. When the session ended, nothing definitive had been said. Yet everyone in the room understood that lines had been crossed, not legally but psychologically. The neighbor left quieter than before. The fight drained from him, replaced by something like calculation. The investigators watched him go, aware that pressure creates movement, and movement reveals paths. That night, as rain slicked the streets and London resumed its indifferent rhythm, the case sat on the edge of resolution and collapse at the same time. Evidence accumulated without quite tipping the balance. The wall had been opened. The silence had been punctured. But the truth, full and complete, still resisted capture, hovering just beyond reach, daring the investigators to make the final leap without falling into the void that had swallowed the case for so long. Pressure does not announce itself when it begins to work. It settles quietly, changes posture, alters breathing, reveals itself in routines that no longer quite hold. In the weeks that followed the lab results, the neighbor's life began to narrow, his movements tracked, his contacts logged, the familiar shrinking into something constrained and brittle. Surveillance teams noted how rarely he left the flat now, how often he stood at the window, watching the street as if it were watching him back. Isolation, once a choice, had become a condition. The detectives shifted their focus outward, widening the lens beyond the building, beyond the street, into the long aftermath of the disappearance. They examined how the neighbor had navigated the years that followed, how he spoke about the case when it resurfaced in the media, how his language shifted subtly over time. Early interviews framed it as tragedy. Later ones framed it as inconvenience. Now he framed it as persecution. The evolution was telling. People reveal their relationship to events not just in what they say, but in how that relationship changes. They pulled transcripts from radio call-ins, letters to editors, comments made in passing that had once seemed inconsequential. In one years earlier he had complained about sensationalism, about how the case refused to die, about how it haunted the street unfairly. At the time it sounded civic-minded. Now it sounded personal. His proximity to the narrative had always been closer than he admitted. The investigation found momentum in an unexpected place, not in evidence but in absence. The neighbor had never taken a holiday longer than a few days. He had never been away during key anniversaries. He had never distanced himself physically from the site of the disappearance. For some, that might indicate innocence, a lack of flight. For others, it suggested something else entirely, a need to remain near, to maintain control over a place that held a secret. Leaving might mean letting go. Staying meant guarding. Meanwhile, the media cycle intensified, feeding on every scrap of information, every ambiguous phrase from police statements. Cold case solved became a refrain, repeated with growing confidence despite official caution. The public appetite for closure is relentless. It demands an ending even when one does not yet exist. Protesters appeared on the street, some calling for justice, others warning against a rush to judgment. The building became a symbol photographed endlessly, its brickwork scrutinized as if the truth might still be visible on its surface. Inside the investigation, doubt remained a constant companion. The legal threshold loomed, unforgiving and exacting. Circumstantial evidence can suggest, even shout, but it cannot convict on its own. The detectives needed leverage, something that would force a break, a contradiction that could not be smoothed over by lawyers and reasonable doubt. That leverage came slowly, through conversation rather than confrontation. They arranged another interview, framed not as interrogation but as clarification, inviting the neighbor to help close loose ends. He arrived subdued, dressed carefully, carrying the weight of someone who knows the ground beneath them is unstable. When asked to recount the night again, he did so with familiar precision, but this time the detectives interrupted, not to accuse but to redirect, asking about emotions rather than actions, about what he had felt rather than what he had done. He spoke about loneliness, about the strange intimacy of shared walls, about how people can misread kindness. He described moments of tension that had never escalated, disagreements that had ended in silence. He did not name the missing woman directly at first, referring to her obliquely as the neighbor, as if language itself were a boundary he could not cross. When he finally used her name, his voice faltered just briefly, enough to register. They asked him about the smell complaint, about the renovations, about the sealed space. He grew defensive again, insisting on coincidence, on bad luck, on the unfairness of suspicion. But then, unprompted, he mentioned timing, spoke about how quickly things can go wrong, how a moment's panic can lead to irreversible decisions. The room stilled. His lawyer shifted. The detectives let the silence stretch, a trap made of patience. He corrected himself, laughed weakly, said he was speaking hypothetically. People do that, he said. Talk in abstractions. But the damage was done. Hypotheticals reveal preoccupations. They surface where the mind lingers. The detectives marked the moment internally, knowing it would not stand alone in court, but would resonate when placed alongside everything else. Outside the interview room, the pressure continued to build. Friends, if he had ever had many, began to distance themselves. The few who remained were questioned, gently, persistently. One admitted that he had once confided, feeling overwhelmed, trapped by something he could never undo. At the time it had been taken as depression, as regret over a wasted life. Now it took on a different shade. The investigators also revisited the missing woman's life, not as a victim but as an active presence in the story. They spoke with colleagues who recalled her growing discomfort in the weeks before she vanished, her mention of feeling watched, of someone knowing her schedule too well. She had dismissed it herself, attributing it to stress, to imagination. People often do. Fear seeks rational explanations until it no longer can. As these pieces aligned, the case approached a precipice. Enough to suspect. Enough to charge, perhaps, if the prosecution was willing to risk it. But the detectives hesitated, aware of the consequences of moving too soon. A failed trial would freeze the truth forever, locking it behind legal finality. They needed one more fracture, one undeniable inconsistency that would tip the balance. That fracture arrived in the form of routine. Surveillance teams noted a change, subtle but significant. The neighbor began to revisit old habits, walking routes he hadn't taken in years, lingering near places connected to the past. One evening, he stopped outside the building, long after he had supposedly moved out temporarily, his gaze fixed on the shared wall now boarded and scarred from the search. He stood there for several minutes, unmoving, before turning away abruptly when he noticed he was not alone. The detectives watched the footage again and again. It wasn't criminal. It wasn't illegal. But it was revealing. People return to the places that define them, especially when those places are under threat of reinterpretation. Memory is territorial. It resists being rewritten. The investigation tightened its grip. Financial pressure mounted as legal costs accrued. Sleep deprivation began to show. The neighbor made mistakes, small ones at first, inconsistencies in statements made to different people, timelines that drifted. Each was logged, cross-referenced, weighed. The net was closing, slowly, deliberately, with the understanding that haste would be fatal. As the city buzzed with speculation and outrage, the detectives remained focused on the quiet work of accumulation. They knew that if the case was ever truly to be solved, it would not be with a dramatic confession or a sudden revelation, but with the steady collapse of a story that could no longer support its own weight. And as that collapse began, barely perceptible but unstoppable, the realization settled in that the end, whatever form it took, would not bring the relief everyone expected, only a deeper understanding of how easily the extraordinary can hide inside the ordinary, waiting for time to make its move. The mistake was small, almost invisible, the kind that slips past unnoticed unless someone is already watching for the slightest tremor. It appeared in a casual remark made to a former colleague over coffee, a conversation that drifted, as conversations often do, toward the news, toward the case everyone was talking about again. He spoke about the search, about the wall, about the investigators tearing his life apart, and then, without realizing it, he mentioned a detail that had never been made public, a specific description of the hidden space, its depth, its awkward angle, the way the bricks narrowed toward the back. The colleague didn't react in the moment. Most people don't when something feels off but not yet alarming. It was only later, replaying the exchange in his head, that the unease sharpened into clarity. That detail hadn't been in the papers. It hadn't been mentioned on television. It had been known only to investigators and to someone who had seen it before the wall came down. By the time he picked up the phone to call the police, his hands were shaking. When the information reached the detectives, it landed with a dull, heavy certainty. This was the fracture they had been waiting for. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but precise. Knowledge is a form of presence. You can't describe a space you've never seen. You can't remember angles and measurements that were never shared. The neighbor's story, already strained, began to split along a line that could not be easily explained away. They brought him in again, this time without pretense. The tone was still controlled, professional, but the questions cut closer, circling the slip, narrowing in on it from multiple angles. At first, he denied saying it. Then he said he must have guessed. Then he said someone else must have told him. Each version contradicted the last, each correction a step deeper into trouble. The room felt smaller with every answer. His lawyer intervened repeatedly, advising caution, calling for breaks, reminding him not to speculate. But the damage was cumulative. Speculation had already occurred. The detectives laid out the contradiction carefully, methodically, not accusing, just comparing. You said this here. You said something different there. This detail was not public. How did you know it? Silence stretched. Breathing grew shallow. The performance faltered. Outside the station, the mood shifted perceptibly. The narrative, once driven by rumor, now had a pivot point, a concrete moment that commentators could latch onto without sounding reckless. The phrase "new evidence" replaced theory in headlines. The public response hardened. Sympathy drained away, replaced by a colder, sharper demand for accountability. People want complexity until it threatens their sense of order. Then they want answers fast. The detectives moved quickly, securing additional warrants, expanding the scope of the investigation to include digital archives, old correspondence, anything that might record private thoughts made public by time. They searched for journals, notes, marginalia, the places where people tell the truth when they think no one is listening. Most of it was mundane. Lists, appointments, fragments of routine life. But buried among it were patterns of fixation, repeated references to the building, to noise, to boundaries, to how easily walls can blur lives together. One notebook, dated years after the disappearance, contained a line written and crossed out so heavily the page had nearly torn. Some things stay where you put them. It could have meant anything. Or nothing. But placed alongside everything else, it resonated, a private echo of the control he had tried so hard to maintain. The prosecution reviewed the file with growing seriousness. This was no longer just a compelling story. It was approaching a case. Risk remained. Defense arguments were obvious and formidable. Contamination. Memory distortion. Coincidence layered into pattern by hindsight. But the cumulative weight was undeniable. The neighbor was no longer simply adjacent to the crime. He was entangled with it in ways that defied benign explanation. When he was informed that charges were being considered, his reaction was not outrage but resignation. The anger that had fueled his earlier protests drained away, leaving something flatter, heavier. He asked about process, about timelines, about what would happen next. Practical questions. Survival questions. When asked again gently if there was anything he wanted to clarify, anything he wanted to say, he shook his head. Not yet, he said. Not like this. The city braced itself. Candlelight vigils appeared outside the building. The same building now stripped of anonymity, transformed into a symbol of proximity and betrayal. People spoke of safety, of trust, of how little we truly know the lives unfolding on the other side of shared walls. The missing woman's name was spoken again with reverence rather than speculation, her absence reframed not as mystery but as injustice. For the detectives, the emotional toll surfaced in quieter moments. Solving a case does not feel like victory when the solution confirms the worst suspicions, when it reveals that the danger was never external, never dramatic, but embedded in the ordinary. They revisited old decisions, old nights spent knocking on doors, old assumptions that had guided them away from the truth. Regret is an occupational hazard. As the case edged closer to formal charges, the neighbor's behavior grew more erratic. He called the station late at night, asking procedural questions he'd already asked, probing for weaknesses, for uncertainty. He lingered near places tied to the past, as if rehearsing something or saying goodbye. Surveillance teams remained alert, aware that pressure can provoke confession or collapse, sometimes both. Then one evening he asked to speak to the lead detective alone. No lawyer. No formal statement. Just a conversation, he said. Off the record. There is no such thing, the detective replied, but he agreed to listen. They sat across from each other in a quiet room, the city's noise muffled by thick glass, the weight of decades pressing in. He did not confess. Not directly. Instead, he spoke about accidents, about how moments spiral beyond intention, about how fear makes people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. He spoke about the tyranny of time, about how the longer you carry something, the harder it becomes to put down. He stopped short of naming what that something was, but the shape of it filled the room. When the conversation ended, nothing new had been said on paper. No admission. No signature. But something had shifted irreversibly. The last defenses of ambiguity had thinned. The case no longer belonged to the realm of speculation. It was moving inexorably toward judgment, toward a courtroom where silence would be weighed alongside words, where proximity would be measured against intent. And yet, even as the machinery of justice began to turn, a quieter unease persisted, because beneath the momentum, beneath the headlines and the legal strategy, lay a truth that could not be neatly resolved, the understanding that some answers once uncovered do not restore what was lost, they only illuminate how long it took to see what had been there all along, waiting undisturbed on the other side of the wall. The charge, when it came, arrived without ceremony, filed in careful language that avoided emotion and spectacle, a document built from inference, probability, and the slow erosion of alternative explanations. It accused without shouting, alleged without dramatizing, and in doing so carried a weight far heavier than any headline. The neighbor was arrested on a quiet morning, escorted from a temporary residence he had retreated to after leaving the flat, his face blank, almost relieved, as if the ambiguity had finally exhausted him. London reacted in fragments. Some people felt vindicated, others disturbed, many unsure what to feel at all. The idea that a cold case could be solved after so long was comforting in theory, but the specifics unsettled everyone who read them. There was no stranger in the shadows, no dramatic chase through the night, just years of proximity, silence, and a wall that had kept its secret until it couldn't anymore. Closure, it turned out, was not the same as comfort. In preparation for trial, the investigation slowed into something more deliberate, less about discovery and more about endurance. Every piece of evidence was re-examined, every witness statement scrutinized for weakness. The defense team moved aggressively, filing motions to suppress, to exclude, to reframe. They argued contamination, media bias, investigative tunnel vision. They questioned the reliability of memories stretched across decades, the integrity of a scene disturbed by time itself. None of it was unreasonable. Justice demands skepticism. The detectives sat through meetings where their work was dissected by people who had not stood in the building, who had not smelled the wall when it was opened, who had not watched the suspect's face change when certain questions were asked. Feelings do not translate into affidavits. Intuition does not survive cross-examination. Everything had to be reduced to what could be shown, not what could be sensed. The missing woman's family, long resigned to not knowing, were brought back into the process with careful steps. They listened as evidence was explained, as timelines were laid out again, this time with sharper edges. Grief resurfaced in new forms, tangled with anger and disbelief. For them, the idea that the person responsible might have been next door all along was not just shocking, it was cruel, a reminder of how close the answers had been, how unreachable. As the trial approached, the city's attention shifted from investigation to anticipation. Courtrooms are places where stories compete, where narratives are weighed not by how true they feel, but by how well they withstand attack. The prosecution's case was strong in accumulation, weaker in any single moment. There was no body presented to the jury, no definitive cause of death, no recorded confession. What there was a pattern, a convergence of facts that pointed insistently in one direction. The defense focused on that absence relentlessly. No body means no murder, they argued. No eyewitness means no certainty. A hidden space does not prove who used it. Objects can be planted. Smells can be misinterpreted. Walls can hide many things. They painted the investigation as a desperate attempt to force meaning onto coincidence, to satisfy public hunger for an ending after too many years of uncertainty. In the courtroom, the suspect sat quietly, his demeanor subdued, almost fragile. He did not look like the monster some had imagined. He looked like an ordinary man worn down by scrutiny, by time, by the collapse of a life built on routine. That ordinariness was its own kind of weapon. Jurors are asked to imagine not just what happened but who could have made it happen. Normalcy complicates that task. Witnesses took the stand one by one, voices shaking as they revisited moments long buried. The colleague who had heard the slip spoke carefully, aware of the weight his memory now carried. The neighbor who had heard voices described the sound again, apologizing for not pushing harder at the time. Experts explained how sound travels through old buildings, how spaces can be hidden, how renovation can erase traces. Each testimony added a brushstroke, but the picture remained impressionistic, never fully sharp. The defense cross-examined with precision, highlighting inconsistencies, emphasizing uncertainty. Memory, they reminded the jury, is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. People fill gaps without realizing it. Investigators driven by theory can unconsciously shape what they see. The case, they argued, was built not on proof but on persuasion. Behind the scenes, the detectives felt the familiar tension of a case slipping out of their hands, not because it was weak, but because the legal system is designed to err on the side of doubt. They knew that even a guilty verdict would not answer every question, and an acquittal would not erase what had been found. The wall had been opened. The space existed. The items were real. Those facts could not be undone. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution leaned into restraint. They did not promise certainty. They asked for reason. They spoke about probability, about how individual details might be explained away, but how their combination formed a narrative that no longer allowed for innocence. They asked the jury to consider not what was missing, but what was present, and why it pointed consistently to one person. The defense responded with a final appeal to caution, to the danger of conviction without absolute proof. They warned against the seductive power of story, against the human need for endings. They asked the jury to remember that doubt is not a flaw in justice, but its foundation. When the jury retired, the city waited. Days passed. Speculation filled the silence. Commentators dissected every gesture, every phrase, every perceived advantage. The missing woman's name trended again. Her life and disappearance reduced to talking points. Her absence stretched thin across screens and debates. For her family, for the detectives, for the street that had carried the weight of the case for decades, the weight was unbearable. Inside the deliberation room, 12 people grappled with a truth that refused to settle neatly. They weighed evidence against absence, instinct against instruction. They considered not just what might have happened, but whether it could be proven to the standard required. Justice, they were reminded, is not about what feels right but about what can be shown beyond reasonable doubt. And as the hours stretched into another night, one thing became clear to everyone watching, whether from outside the courthouse or from the quiet of their own homes. Even if a verdict came, Even if a word like guilty or not guilty was spoken aloud, the case would not truly end there. Some stories do not conclude. They simply change form, leaving behind questions that echo long after the courtroom empties. Questions about proximity, about silence, and about how easily a truth can live next door without being seen. The verdict came quietly, read aloud in a courtroom that seemed too small to contain decades of tension. The words themselves were simple, almost clinical, but their weight crashed into everyone present like a wave long held back. Guilty. The neighbor's expression did not change at first. Relief, fear, defiance, guilt. All seemed compressed into a blank mask that held nothing for a moment before finally cracking in a subtle twitch of the jaw. Some gasped. Some whispered. Some sat frozen, unable to reconcile what they thought they knew with what had been decided. Outside, the city erupted in fragments. Headlines screamed, social media threads exploded. Commentators dissected the timeline in painstaking detail. There was triumph but also unease. People felt vindicated in some way, yes, but the ordinary horror of the crime. A neighbor, someone so close, capable of hiding such darkness, made comfort impossible. London's streets felt sharper, more suspicious. Shared walls suddenly seemed like barriers with secrets pressing behind them. The sense of safety everyone had assumed was a lie, or at least a fragile illusion. The detectives walked back through the rain-slick streets after the announcement, the sound of water against pavement echoing the months, years, decades of investigation. They carried a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep, but everything to do with time spent listening, watching, calculating, waiting for someone to slip, to reveal what ordinary vigilance could not detect. They had solved the cold case, but the cost was not simple. Knowledge had been gained, justice administered, but the shadows lingered. In the building, the space behind the wall remained empty now, stripped, catalogued, photographed, reduced to evidence. Yet it retained a presence, a memory pressed into plaster and brick. Neighbors reported small, uncanny things. Drafts that felt like movement, sounds that didn't belong, the feeling of being watched even when no one was there. Memory is persistent. Trauma leaves fingerprints not only on people but on space. The family of the missing woman struggled to accept the verdict fully. They had waited decades for an answer, and now it was here, but it did not bring the satisfaction imagined in their minds. The absence remained. The small daily details of a life never lived could not be restored. They clung to fragments. A photograph, a letter, the memory of laughter. Justice had come in one form, but loss remained absolute. Inside the courtroom, the neighbor's demeanor shifted subtly as sentencing approached. He was no longer defensive. There was a quiet calculation, the way someone who knows they have survived more than just scrutiny carries themselves. His gaze lingered on familiar objects, corners of the room, the ceiling lights. Patterns that once reassured him now offered no solace. Even his own ordinary life could no longer be trusted. Legal strategists argued over the minimum and maximums, over reductions, over mitigating circumstances. Decades-old evidence was weighed, testimony revisited, the law applied with precision. Every day stretched, measured in small increments, the weight of past, present, and consequence pressing equally on everyone involved. Justice, it seemed, was never instantaneous. It unfolded in careful, deliberate increments. As the final days before sentencing arrived, the city watched quietly. The news cycle had shifted in small waves, but the story remained, embedded in collective memory. People discussed the case at pubs, cafes, on buses. They spoke of fear, proximity, how little we really know about those who live closest to us. The building itself became a character in the story, its brick walls and narrow hallways carrying echoes of history, of secrets, of ordinary horror. In private, the detectives reviewed the case one last time. Files were reorganized, notes double-checked, photographs indexed. They did not speak of victory. They spoke in low tones about procedure, gaps that remained, questions that lingered. Because even after decades and a verdict, there were fragments that never fully fit. An unexplained sound, a vague memory from a neighbor, a fleeting shadow in a photograph. Cold cases are never truly closed. They are merely transformed. The suspect was transported quietly, escorted through hallways that had seen so many stories, past reporters, past onlookers, into custody that would hold him for the months to come. His silence was absolute, but the world outside interpreted it in millions of ways. acceptance, defiance, regret, calculation. Even that silence in the end could not contain the full story. And so the building remained. The walls, the stairs, the small hallway where light rarely reached, all persisted in their silent witness. People returned to routines, to work, to mundane interactions, but nothing could entirely erase the knowledge that proximity can conceal darkness, that ordinary spaces can hide extraordinary secrets, and that time, patient and persistent, will eventually reveal what the world has tried to forget. London, in its indifferent rhythm, moved on, but the echo of the 1987 disappearance, the hidden wall, and the neighbor living next door lingered. People spoke of it quietly, warned children, glanced sideways at their own neighbors, and wondered which of the ordinary spaces around them carried stories that would only surface decades later. Even in resolution, the case left an indelible mark, a reminder that safety is often an illusion, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we think we know best. The detectives closed the case files for now, but in the quiet hours, long after the courtroom emptied and the media cycle shifted, they returned in their minds to the wall, to the hidden space, to the items preserved as evidence, and to the neighbor who had lived so close for so long unseen. Because even solved cold cases are not truly solved until every shadow, every creak, every fragment of memory has been accounted for. And even then, the city remembers. The cold case had been solved, but the chilling reality remained. The secret had lived in plain sight, behind a wall no one thought to question, next door to lives that assumed normalcy, hidden in plainness for decades, until patience, persistence, and accident combined to expose it, forever altering the understanding of safety, trust, and proximity in one small corner of London. The shadow of 1987 stretched beyond conviction, beyond headlines, beyond evidence, into memory itself, lingering in the minds of all who had witnessed, investigated, or simply lived near it. And in that lingering, the city felt, briefly, the weight of how close danger can truly reside, quiet, ordinary, and unseen. Even after sentencing, the echoes of the case refused to fade. London streets returned to their rhythm, buses rumbled, markets opened, children ran along sidewalks, and yet, in pockets of the city, the memory of the 1987 disappearance lingered like a chill that refuses sunlight. People who had followed the trial closely carried the story with them, whispered warnings in stairwells, glanced at neighbors with newfound suspicion, felt the weight of a secret that had once existed, hidden in plain sight. The building where it all happened became a quiet monument. Some tenants moved out, unable to bear proximity to its history. Others remained, adjusting as if the events were a scar pressed into the bricks. Workers who repaired the facade spoke in hushed tones about the wall, about the hidden void, about the ordinary horror of a secret lived next door for decades. Even the physical space seemed to absorb memory, the plastered-over recess now a silent witness to lives that had been altered irreversibly. The detectives returned to their offices, reviewing their notes one last time. They had solved a cold case that had haunted them for years, pieced together fragments of time, evidence, and human behavior, and yet they felt no triumph. Justice had been served in one form, but the human cost, the decades of fear, uncertainty, and absence, could never be undone. They knew that their work, while legally complete, could not erase the deeper truths, how easily the ordinary hides the extraordinary, how close danger can dwell without being suspected. The missing woman's family continued to navigate life in the shadow of resolution. The knowledge of the neighbor's guilt brought no comfort for the empty spaces she once filled, for the milestones never celebrated, for the moments that would never exist. Justice, they understood, was only one element in a lifetime shaped by absence. Each photograph, letter, or memory became a talisman, a fragile connection to a life severed too soon, reminding them that closure is never whole. Public fascination waned gradually, leaving behind a lingering unease. Discussions about neighbors, walls, hidden spaces, and what lies behind the closed doors of ordinary lives persisted in conversations, social media, and local lore. People became more cautious, more attentive to subtle behaviors, more aware that the extraordinary could exist not in shadows or strangers, but in the rhythm of normal everyday life. For the neighbor, imprisonment became routine. Days measured in steps, in walls, in light and shadow. The bravado of years past dissipated. He moved through the system as someone who had survived exposure, but could not undo what had been revealed. Conversations with other inmates, letters, quiet reflections. None could restore the ordinary life he had hidden behind. Proximity, secrecy, and patience had protected him for decades. But in the end, exposure came not with violence or confrontation, but with time, chance, and relentless observation. The detectives occasionally returned to the building for follow-ups, maintenance oversight, or documentation. Each visit reminded them of the invisible pressures that had shaped the case, of the subtle patterns and behaviors that had gone unnoticed for so long. Every floorboard creak, every echo in the stairwell, every flicker of light reminded them that ordinary spaces can conceal extraordinary truths, and that vigilance is both necessary and exhausting. In academic circles, law enforcement seminars, and training programs, the case became an example of how patience, cross-disciplinary investigation, and careful attention to detail can resolve cold cases long thought impossible. Lectures dissected timelines, evidence handling, behavioral observation, and the psychology of proximity. But even in these professional settings, instructors reminded students that the human element, the fear, the secrecy, the ordinary horror, cannot be quantified. It lingers in ways no file or record can fully contain. Years later, casual observers who walked past the building sensed nothing unusual. London moved on as cities do, absorbing stories into its endless rhythm. The streetlights, the brick walls, the narrow staircases remained the same, indifferent to history. Yet those who knew, those who had studied, those who lived with memory, understood that some spaces remember. Some walls retain the imprint of secrets long kept, and sometimes, those imprints ripple outward in ways the world can never fully reconcile. Even as new cases emerged, new headlines flashed, and life resumed its ordinary pace, the shadow of 1987 persisted. It existed in whispers and lessons learned, in the heightened awareness of proximity and trust, and in the unshakable realization that danger often resides where it is least expected. The cold case had been solved, but the city, the building, the investigators, and the family carried its residue forever. A quiet, persistent reminder that the past, once disturbed, cannot be returned to its original silence. And so the story ends, not with triumph or closure, but with vigilance, memory, and the lingering sense that the ordinary can hide the extraordinary, that walls may conceal what eyes do not see, and that sometimes, the truth waits decades to reveal itself, quietly, inexorably, and with consequences that stretch far beyond the resolution of a single case. The cold case was solved, the secret uncovered, but the echo remains, and for anyone living next door, it is a chilling truth. You may never know who truly resides beside you, or what has been hiding behind walls in silence all along. Even years after the trial, the story of the 1987 disappearance refused to settle into memory. London streets continued their indifferent rhythm, but beneath the hum of buses, the chatter of markets, the laughter of children, the echo of that hidden wall lingered like a pulse no one could quite ignore. People who had been neighbors, passers-by, or casual witnesses carried fragments of it with them. Glimpses, whispers, shivers of recognition whenever ordinary life touched on something uncanny. The building itself remained, outwardly unchanged, yet impossibly heavy, as if the bricks had absorbed the decades of fear, the tension, the quiet vigilance that had unfolded behind its walls. The detectives, long retired from direct duty, occasionally returned, not for evidence, not for media attention, but to remember the case in the quiet, to retrace steps that had become instinctual. They walked the stairwells, examined the corners where shadows had clung, traced the paths of movement that had once revealed patterns invisible to everyone else. Each visit reminded them that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that silence is not absence, and that proximity can hide what imagination refuses to believe. For the missing woman's family, the verdict never fully healed the wound. Justice had arrived, but it was precise and legal, not restorative. Time had stolen years, milestones, conversations, laughter, and a life that would never unfold. They carried the memory with them, not like a burden, but like a scar that refused to fade. A permanent mark of absence and revelation. Every anniversary, every day in the streets she once walked, every glance at the building reminded them that resolution does not erase loss. It only frames it. The convicted neighbor adjusted to prison life with grim efficiency. Isolation became routine. Walls replaced walls, shadows replaced shadow. He rarely spoke of the past, and when he did, it was carefully, obliquely, as if the very words might undo him. In those moments he seemed smaller, diminished by the relentless passage of time and by the inevitability of exposure. He had hidden for decades in plain sight, and now, stripped of ordinary surroundings, the ordinary could no longer shield him. In the city, the story became legend, a cautionary tale repeated in hushed tones, seminars, and local lore. It was told to students, law enforcement trainees, and the curious. About patience, about patterns, about the ordinary horror of secrets kept next door. People learned to watch for subtle signs, small discrepancies, faint traces of obsession or control. Yet, despite all the lessons, London moved forward, indifferent and eternal, absorbing stories into its rhythm, letting only faint echoes remain for those who knew where to listen. The building itself never regained innocence. Even after renovations, even after new tenants arrived, there was a quiet weight to it, a presence that felt almost alive. Stairwells whispered memories, hallways remembered footsteps, walls kept secrets. Anyone passing through the lobby felt it, though they could not name why. The ordinary carries traces of the extraordinary, waiting, patient, silent. And somewhere in the city, people continued to live side by side with strangers. The lesson of 1987 persisted, quietly insistent. Proximity can conceal danger. Walls, doors, and mundane appearances offer no guarantees. The extraordinary can hide in plain sight, nurtured by routine, patience, and the blindness of familiarity. Time can reveal the truth, but it cannot undo the years of concealment. For those who knew the full story, the city never felt quite the same again. Every neighbor became a question mark, every quiet flat a potential secret, every closed door a space that might hide a story waiting to emerge. Even the solved cold case did not restore certainty. It only illuminated how fragile perception is, how easily the ordinary can cloak the extraordinary, and how a secret, once unearthed, can echo indefinitely. In the end, the cold case had been solved, the hidden wall revealed, the neighbor convicted. But the shadow of 1987 stretches still, a quiet, unyielding reminder that some truths reside forever in the spaces between walls, between lives, and between the moments when vigilance meets coincidence. London remembers, not in headlines, not in trials, but in the silent weight of ordinary places, the fleeting shivers of intuition, and the persistent question of what lies just out of sight, waiting patiently for time to finally tell its story. The story was over, yet it was never truly over. The echo remains in every creak of a floorboard, in every shadow across a wall, in every neighbor who seems ordinary, until the extraordinary emerges once more. And that is the haunting legacy of a cold case solved decades too late. The knowledge that what is hidden next door can linger in memory long after the wall has been opened. Years passed, decades even, and yet the story of 1987 lingered in the city's consciousness like a shadow that never fully receded. London continued its relentless rhythm, traffic, markets, laughter, and life unfolding. But beneath it all, there was a subtle tension, an invisible awareness that ordinary walls could conceal extraordinary darkness. People walked past the building, glanced up at windows, felt the weight of a history they could not see, and instinctively wondered what secrets lay behind closed doors. For the detectives who had solved the case, retirement did not bring relief. They carried the echoes of that wall, of the hidden space, of the neighbor who had lived unobserved for decades. In quiet moments, walking home, brewing tea, sitting on a park bench, they replayed details. A misplaced brick, a sound that had seemed trivial, the way shadows had shifted on a floorboard. They understood more than anyone else that solving a case does not erase its presence. It only transforms it. The ordinary becomes extraordinary in memory. The family of the missing woman continued to navigate life with a careful reverence for absence. Her name was spoken sparingly, in moments of reflection, in anniversaries, in quiet conversations. Justice had been delivered, but it could not restore the time stolen. The milestones never reached, the laughter never shared. They lived with the knowledge that proximity had concealed danger for years, and that the ordinary life next door had masked horror. That knowledge never left them. Even the convicted neighbor, now serving a long sentence, carried the residue of years spent in concealment. Walls had once hidden him. Now walls enclosed him. Time had stripped him of pretense, of freedom, of ordinary life. His mind replayed scenarios endlessly. What had been seen, what had been missed, how long the secret could have remained unexposed. In silence, he confronted the inevitability that what is hidden cannot remain so forever, and that the ordinary is often its own camouflage. The building, unremarkable to most, became a locus of memory, a silent monument to secrecy. Tenants came and went, unaware of the past, while the bricks held onto it, as if walls themselves could remember. Hallways absorbed whispers, stairwells retained echoes of footsteps, and rooms preserved the imprint of lives altered forever. Ordinary space, the detectives had learned, is never neutral. It holds memory, intention, and secrets waiting patiently for time to reveal them. In the broader city, the story became legend. Students of criminology and law enforcement dissected it in seminars, analyzing the patterns of behavior, the timing, the minutiae that led to revelation. Journalists revisited it in documentaries. And yet, even in scholarly analysis, there was a persistent unease. The ordinary horror of proximity, the subtle danger embedded in routine, the reminder that the extraordinary can hide in plain sight for decades. And still, ordinary life continued. London breathed, moved, and lived its rhythms, indifferent yet forever altered. Neighbors walked past each other, children played on sidewalks, commuters boarded trains, all carrying their own ordinary secrets, unaware of the invisible histories woven into the buildings around them. The lesson lingered quietly, embedded in intuition and vigilance. Some dangers reside not in the shadows, but in plain view behind walls within lives we assume we know. For those who remembered, the story became a cautionary echo, a reminder that time is patient, that silence can conceal, that ordinary life can harbor extraordinary truth. The cold case had been solved, yes, but the legacy of what was discovered endured. An unsettling, invisible pulse beneath the city's rhythm. Every wall, every stairwell, every neighbor's glance carried the possibility of secrets yet undiscovered, waiting decades perhaps to emerge. The case had ended in the courtroom, but in memory and space it persisted. London carried it quietly, like a scar beneath the surface of ordinary life. And for anyone walking past that building or living next door to an ordinary neighbor, the truth whispered softly yet insistently. You never truly know what lies behind the walls around you, or what has been hiding in silence all along. The cold case was closed, the neighbor convicted, the evidence catalogued, the story told. But the shadow remains, patient, persistent, and unyielding, a reminder that the extraordinary often resides in the most ordinary of places, waiting to be seen. Decades after 1987, the case continues to echo, not in courtrooms or files, but in the city itself, in subtle shifts that only those who know to look can perceive. London hums with its familiar rhythm, trains, traffic, footsteps, but beneath that cadence, there is a quiet, pervasive unease, a lingering sense that ordinary walls may conceal extraordinary truths. The building at the center of the cold case stands unchanged, yet charged with memory, each brick and stairwell bearing witness to secrets, proximity, and decades of silent concealment. People pass by without realizing, but instinct remembers. Tenants, visitors, neighbors all feel it faintly. A glance too sharp, a shadow too long, a floorboard that creaks like it carries a whisper. Ordinary life carries these residues, shaping perception without conscious thought, leaving a subtle imprint of vigilance, suspicion, and the knowledge that danger can live quietly, next door for decades. The detectives who cracked the case have aged, yet the story follows them. Even in retirement, the images, the timelines, the subtle clues linger. In quiet rooms, in the dark hours before sleep, they replay every detail. The wall that hid the truth, the neighbor who lived beside it, the objects discovered, the omissions, the clues that only revealed themselves over time. Solving the cold case did not release them. It left an awareness that ordinary life is never truly ordinary, that the hidden can exist comfortably alongside the visible, and that patience is both a weapon and a burden. The family of the missing woman continues to live with absence as a presence. Even with justice served, the void remains. Her life erased too soon is recalled in fragments. A laugh, a letter, a memory of a touch or glance. Justice addresses the act, the crime, the guilty, but it cannot restore the lost years, cannot bring back the days spent waiting, hoping, wondering. That absence has become a form of gravity, pulling the story forward into every day, every thought, every quiet reflection. In the prison where the neighbor serves his sentence, time has a different weight. Walls replace walls. Shadows replace shadows. The ordinary protections of normal life, the invisibility of routine, have been stripped away, leaving only introspection, the constant replay of proximity, and the knowledge that exposure is final, inescapable, and absolute. He survives, but he is smaller, diminished by the years of concealment that are now impossibly visible, catalogued, and remembered. Across the city, the story has entered legend. Not headlines, not textbooks alone, but conversations, cautionary tales, whispered warnings about neighbors, hidden spaces, and ordinary life masking extraordinary acts. Scholars dissect the timelines, investigators study the behavior, journalists retell the suspense, and yet the most haunting lesson is simple. Proximity can conceal danger. The ordinary can harbor darkness, and time can obscure it until revelation finally arrives. Buildings remember. Stairwells recall steps. Hallways whisper echoes. Even renovations cannot erase memory. Ordinary spaces, it seems, retain the past, imprinted with human intention, obsession, and concealment. London itself, indifferent yet observant, absorbs these stories into its rhythm, leaving only subtle traces for those who know how to see. The public has largely moved on, yet the resonance of 1987 persists. People glance at neighbors differently, check locks more carefully, listen more intently, suspect more quietly. The ordinary horror of the case. A neighbor, someone familiar, hiding unimaginable acts, has altered perception. The story is no longer just history. It is vigilance encoded in memory, caution carried unconsciously, an invisible imprint on the rhythm of everyday life. Even for those who had no direct connection, the shadow of the case exists. It shapes instinct, wariness, attention to nuance, the sense that the familiar may conceal the unthinkable. The solved cold case becomes a lesson, a warning. The extraordinary can live quietly, invisibly, among us. It can wait decades for discovery, and when revealed, it changes not just the lives directly involved, but the very perception of safety, trust, and ordinary life itself. The case, though technically closed, persists in stories, memory, and reflection. Its echo stretches across neighborhoods, stairwells, and city blocks. And for anyone who pauses, listens, and observes, there is an unshakable truth. The extraordinary often resides behind ordinary walls, in the rhythm of lives we assume we understand, and in secrets that time, patience, and chance will eventually unearth. The cold case is solved. The wall is open. The neighbor is convicted. Yet the shadow remains unyielding, patient, a persistent reminder that proximity can harbor darkness, that ordinary spaces conceal extraordinary truths, and that the memory of 1987 will echo quietly, persistently, and hauntingly, long after the headlines have faded. Even decades later, the story refuses to fade. London moves with its usual rhythm, traffic, sirens, footsteps, the chatter of everyday life, but beneath that cadence, there is a hidden layer of memory, of unease, of vigilance born from 1987. People walk past ordinary buildings and stairwells with a faint awareness, a quiet hesitation, as if the city itself whispers that danger can reside in plain sight. The building at the heart of the cold case still stands, ordinary to the casual eye, but heavy with history, silence, and secrets that once lived behind walls unnoticed decades long. The detectives who solved the case carry it with them into retirement, and even into dreams. The hidden space, the neighbor who lived next door, the evidence cataloged and analyzed, they replay in quiet rooms, in subway rides, in early mornings when the city is half asleep. Time has not diminished the weight. It has only transformed it into an acute awareness of the ordinary's capacity for concealment. They know now that the subtle details, the way shadows move, how walls absorb sound, how routine can hide obsession, matter more than any headline ever could. For the family, life continues with a strange duality. Justice has been served, yet absence persists like a phantom limb. Her laughter, her presence, the life she might have led. All are gone, yet remain vividly alive in memory. Each anniversary, each encounter with a familiar street or building, is tinged with the knowledge that a neighbor, someone ordinary, harbored unimaginable darkness. Closure is partial. It exists alongside grief, suspicion, and a lingering understanding of how ordinary life masks extraordinary secrets. The convicted neighbor exists in a world entirely defined by boundaries, walls, bars, rules. He has lost the ordinary camouflage that once protected him. The ordinary gestures, the casual routines, the very act of being unnoticed, these privileges are gone. In their place are the relentless observation, the echoes of discovery, the weight of time and exposure, and the understanding that no wall can conceal forever. The city has absorbed the story into its rhythm, though most are unaware. Buildings retain memory, stairwells echo steps, and halls remember the patterns of life and concealment. Ordinary spaces are never neutral. They carry traces of the past, and those who pass through them, consciously or not, inherit a fragment of their history. London moves on, but the memory of 1987 persists in subtle ways. A glance at a neighbor, a fleeting sense of unease in a quiet corridor, a shiver when a shadow does not belong. Stories of the case circulate quietly, among law enforcement, in seminars, in whispered warnings, in documentaries, but the lessons are not just academic. They are practical, psychological, enduring. Vigilance, observation, patience, and the uncomfortable truth that ordinary life can harbor unimaginable darkness. People carry the residue unknowingly. Instinct, memory, and caution intertwine with the daily routines of commuting, shopping, walking. The ordinary horror of proximity changes perception, permanently. Even the buildings themselves bear witness. Renovation cannot erase memory. Floorboards creak in familiar ways, walls retain shadows, the air seems charged with the presence of what was discovered decades ago. Ordinary spaces become haunted, not by ghosts but by memory, by vigilance, by the invisible weight of secrecy revealed. London remembers in the spaces between life, in the quiet, in the ordinary turned extraordinary. And so the story endures. The cold case has been solved. Justice has been rendered. The wall has been opened. The neighbor has been convicted. Yet the shadow persists, extending into decades of memory, reflection, and caution. The extraordinary hides behind ordinary walls, waiting for time, patience, and chance to reveal it. For anyone who lives beside a stranger, passes a quiet building, or notices a faint irregularity in the familiar, the lesson is clear and chilling. The ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, and some secrets, once uncovered, will echo forever. The case is closed, the verdict delivered, the story told. And yet London, in all its streets, buildings, and shadows, continues to hum with the quiet, persistent echo of 1987, reminding all who listen that proximity can mask danger, that walls can hide the unimaginable, and that some truths refuse to be forgotten.